In this video, I want to have a look now at the chapter 1 in a volume of essays that was edited about 10-ish years ago by Roger Crisp, called Griffin on Human Rights. So what this is now is basically a collection of reactions to Griffin's work on human rights, one of the most important works, I think, on human rights of probably the last 20 odd years. Okay, now this first chapter is by Carl Wellman and it's called Two Approaches to Human Rights. So basically, just as sort of a big picture of this article, it's a short one, I'm just going to hit the highlights of it. But sort of before I even hit the highlights, sort of like the highlights of the highlights, goes something like this. He's going to take a different approach. So Griffin's is one approach, Wellman's is the other. Two approaches, right? And he wants to say that of course there's differences, but they're not as much as maybe Griffin or maybe readers may think. So Griffin has a very bottom-up approach that we've seen in the videos. Go back and look at them on Griffin, where he's trying to look at something from a bottom up. He doesn't like that much of an abstract approach. He wants to go straight to the substantive theory of human rights. Doesn't want to go through this circuitous route through a sort of an indirect theory of rights in general, right? Well, Wellman is going that other route, more of a top-down way of looking at, a theory of rights in general. And he wants to use a famous example of rights analysis in a legal context by Hohlfeld, right? So Hohlfeld's analysis is a well-known analysis of rights. And so that's sort of a legalistic approach that Wellman wants to take. So you can think of Griffin as the substantive, kind of philosophical, going right for the grounds of human rights and looking at values and things like that. Or you might want to take it more from a legal kind of lawyerly judge kind of approach and look at the legal notion of rights first and then look at human rights in that legal context, right? So hence, again, the two different ways. So again, Griffin, thinks he's bottom up. Wellman is talking top down, but he doesn't think. Wellman wants to argue that both sides are kind of necessary, right? So it's not a surprise. Quite often in philosophical discussions, you find that different angles to create a theory are often preferable than just one sort of line of attack. So he says that, there's three similarities. I didn't write them all out. You can go to the article and have a look. But three similarities. They're both, between his project and that of Griffin's, right? They're dealing with human rights. They both want to find a theory that explains human rights, conceived of as fundamental moral rights. They want a theory that's useful in solving philosophical problems, right? I mean, that's how we end. You judge a theory in the end. In philosophy, just like anything, does it solve problems, right? If it doesn't, well, then it's arguably not that useful, right? If it doesn't solve problems that the theory is constructed to apply to. So theories have a domain of application, and if it doesn't work in that intended domain of application, not a great theory. Maybe you're missing something, right? So there is a way to check up on these things. Scientists were used to them doing that all the time. They always talk about, does it solve the problems in its intended domain of interpretation, or not interpretation, intended domain of application. All right, so an account, a teleologically grounded account. He says he wants to find that, and so does Griffin too. That is an account of how human rights are grounded on human values, and that this is some kind of, as he says, a utilitarian style of theory. All right. Griffin might not quite agree with that, but in any case, something grounded on values ultimately. So do you go directly to the values as Griffin does, or do you kind of do this circuitous route through legal issues as Wellman does? All right. So remember, Griffin, because Griffin doubts that he's a little bit skeptical. He says, so Wellman says, I'm taking a different approach to human rights than Griffin. And remember, Griffin doubts that human rights are merely a species of rights. Griffin rejects this Hohlfeldian analysis. Again, you can look at Wellman's text for the Hohlfeldian analysis, and there's lots of information available on how Hohlfeld does this. It's a very well-known analysis of rights. Griffin doesn't like that. Griffin wants to go straight to the substantive ground, like this philosophical approach. He wants to deal with personhood and dignity and all these things in order to talk about human rights. So what's a human right? Well, let's go right to the philosophical meat of the situation and look at issues like dignity and personhood, right? That's where that's sort of the direct line of approach. Wellman is like, no, I'm going to do the other approach. It's a legalistic one. Human rights, moral rights, and other species of rights, they're all similar to legal rights. And so again, it's more of an indirect approach than Griffin's top down. This one, bottom up here in Griffin's works. And of course, in the whole fields analysis, there's at least 4 fundamental kinds of legal rights. So it's a complicated type of analysis, but again, many scholars, legal scholars and philosophers have found it very useful. Lots of times it comes up in analysis of war, just war theory, when you're talking about the right to you said bellum, the right to, justice in war and things like that. Some people approach this on a Hoffellian type of analysis. But he thinks that, so why would you go this circuitous route? Like, why not go right to the meat of it? This might be intuitively more attractive to go directly to this personhood and dignity. Problem is, Wellman says, is if you go that route, yeah, you've got this. He does like that direct approach. When he asked at the end, what's better? He's like, I like that direct approach, but it's a complicated one, because if you say this to someone, okay, yeah, I want to talk about human rights, and then you say, okay, now I'm going to talk about personhood and all these kinds of big philosophical notions. There's so much disagreement, right? It's sort of familiar, but it's very difficult terrain, and it's controversial, and the disagreements start flying right away. Yeah, what do you mean by dignity? What do you mean by personhood? And all these kinds of questions immediately come in. And so in that sense, it might appear to be very intuitive and natural terrain. It's actually quite abstract and quite removed. That's just Wellman's point, as I read him. And so in that sense, if you talk about human rights in the context of moral rights and species, other species of rights and legal rights, if you say, oh, you want to talk about human rights, I'm not going to go diving right into the dignity stuff right away. I'm going to look at just what is a right, what is a legal right. Let's talk about rights that we're familiar, the right that basic kinds of rights that we think are just rights in society. So what do we mean when we say a right? And that's where the whole Hoffellian analysis comes in. So in that sense, it might be an indirect route, but it's starting with more familiar terrain, like things that, I don't know, the right of free speech or whatever. It might be something easier to handle. It might be controversial, but it's something a little bit easier than just jumping immediately to the notion of dignity and human rights. So biting off something a little bit more familiar and chewing on that before you take the big bite into these kinds of deeper issues. I mean, that's where you want to go in the end. He says that's ultimately what we're looking for, is some kind of analysis that's going to handle all this deep stuff. But maybe it's better to start this way and work our way towards it. Even so you maybe have a longer path, but it might be an easier path rather than this really difficult one. And maybe it's a little shorter, but a little bit more complicated. So in the end, he likes Griffin's approach. But he said, this indirect approach, as I've pointed out, it certainly has its merit. And he also says that even in his own approach at Griffin, if you really think them through, neither is a purely top-down, neither is a purely bottom-up. Each of them have elements of the other. So he says roughly that he says, well, my approach is admittedly a top-down. So you can think of it as when he was discussing the contrast and the comparison and contrast between his approach. It sort of reminded me, it's like you could think of Wellman's like having a bigger sort of set of things up here to start with, legal and all this stuff, and then sort of narrowing in. Whereas this one is going to start with this big thing right at the bottom, and it too will draw upon other things later on, but as it narrows, as it goes up. But the main point, if that wasn't terribly clear, the main point is that in his own analysis, Wellman says he has elements of the bottom up, and if you read Griffin carefully, he has elements of top down. So neither's got a real pure method. It's just where is the emphasis, and Griffin is more of a bottom up emphasis. Wellman says I'm more of a top down emphasis. But again, both of them have merit, even though, he kind of admits he kind of likes that first one. And I think there's something intuitively appealing if you say, what's a human right? And then someone says, well, to talk about human rights, we've got to talk about dignity, right? Those are intuitively very appealing and intrinsically fascinating notions. Like what, Kant, for instance, struggled with and articulated a concept of what is dignity. So this idea of dignity has been very important throughout the Western philosophical tradition. And of course, he ends on the note that both of them are going to be needed. And in the end, how do we judge philosophical theories? As I said at the beginning of this video, just like we judge any theory, you've got to look at the intended domain of application of that theory and ask yourself, in this case, the practical problems that are involved with human rights. Does my theory of human rights help to solve those problems? Now, what does it mean to solve a problem about human rights and all that? That's going to be a matter of debate as well. But again, there is a pragmatic element underneath all of this because this is what we're talking about. To go back to Socrates, we're talking about the notion of living together. And so when we're talking about human rights, we're talking about problems that we encounter as we try to live together. And do our theories of human rights help us to resolve these practical problems? That is, these conflicts that we come across in our everyday lives, whether on the small scale or everyday lives on the big scale, like international relations. Okay, so there you go. The two approaches, chapter 1, Carl Wellman, Two Approaches to Human Rights.